General Hospital spoilers reveal that Emma had always been the type of woman who didn't wait for opportunities, she created them. Her years away from Port Charles hadn't dulled her instincts or her ambition. If anything, they had made her sharper, bolder. And now, back in the heart of chaos, she had her eyes locked on Dalton, a man as enigmatic as he was dangerous, a man who had power, secrets, and a past that she was determined to uncover, control, or both. But it wasn't just power that drew Emma to Dalton. There was an undeniable magnetism, a brooding allure that both repelled and fascinated her. She told herself it was all part of her strategy. Part of the larger game she was playing. Yet beneath the surface, even she could feel the lines between strategy and seduction beginning to blur. It started innocently. With glances held a little too long, casual touches that lingered, conversations that danced on the edge of personal. Emma knew exactly what she was doing, feeding Dalton's ego, making him feel seen, admired, desired. She positioned herself not just as an ally, but as a confidant, someone who understood the shadows in him because she carried her own. Her beauty, intelligence, and poise made it easy. But what she didn't anticipate was how closely she was being watched, by Gio. Gio, once trusting and open, now simmered with something darker. The recent trauma. The unraveling truths about his parentage, and the chaos surrounding his family had changed him. He had always admired Emma. Even cared for her in a way that he never quite understood until she returned. Now, watching her sidle up to Dalton with that gleam in her eye, the one she used when she wanted something inside Gio twisted. At first, it was confusion, then discomfort. And then full-blown jealousy. He had never admitted it out loud, even to himself, but seeing Emma turn her attention to Dalton ignited something in him that felt like betrayal. Not because she owed him anything, but because part of him had always believed she saw him, truly saw him, in a way no one else did. The idea that Emma might be using Dalton, or worse, falling for him, wasn't just unsettling, it was maddening. Gio became obsessed. He tried to play it cool, tried to convince himself that he was only concerned for Emma's safety. After all, Dalton wasn't just a man with a dark past, he was entangled in networks of power, secrets, and manipulation that could easily devour someone like Emma, no matter how cunning she thought she was. Gio told himself that was why he followed them, why he lingered outside their meetings, why he started checking on her more often. Asking probing questions with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. But the truth was, he wasn't protecting her. He was losing control. He began replaying every interaction between them in his head, looking for signs, clues, anything to suggest Emma was still his ally, still loyal to him in whatever unspoken way he had always hoped. And when he couldn't find those signs, the darkness in him deepened. Meanwhile, Emma was well aware of Joe's watchful presence. She could feel the weight of his gaze. The tension in his posture whenever Dalton was near. She knew Gio too well to be oblivious to his jealousy, but instead of pulling back, she leaned in. Not because she wanted to hurt him, but because part of her believed that pushing him to the edge would finally force him to confront what they really were to each other. Emma had always danced on the edge of chaos. She believed in control, but only when it suited her. And now, watching both Dalton's interests sharpen and Joe's emotions spiral, she realized she was playing a far more dangerous game than she had anticipated. Dalton, for his part, was no fool. He knew Emma was up to something. He didn't trust her, not entirely, but he enjoyed the game. There was something exhilarating about her challenge, the way she dared to stand toe-to-toe with him, fearless and sharp. He fed off it. And yet, even as he indulged her flirtations, even as he let her into his confidence, he was calculating. He wondered how much of her attention was real and how much was performance. He saw the glances between her and Gio, the way Gio tensed when she laughed a little too loudly at one of Dalton's jokes. He knew a rivalry when he saw one, and he intended to exploit it. As the days passed, the triangle twisted tighter. Emma continued to play her part, half seductress, half strategist, feeding Dalton breadcrumbs of intimacy while keeping her true intentions buried. Gio spiraled further, torn between his love for Emma and his hatred for Dalton. He began to act impulsively, dangerously, risking exposure just to be close to Emma. Just to remind her that he was still there. One night, after a particularly tense meeting between Emma and Dalton, Gio confronted her. His words were harsh, accusing, his eyes filled with hurt. Emma didn't back down. She challenged him, forced him to admit what he had never said, that he couldn't bear the thought of her being with anyone else. That confrontation shattered the delicate balance. Emma, for all her control, was shaken. Joe's confession hit harder than she expected. Because buried beneath her schemes and strategies was a truth she hadn't dared face. Part of her cared for Gio in a way that defied reason, in a way that complicated everything. Dalton, watching from the shadows, saw everything he needed. He knew the real power wasn't in seduction or control, it was in understanding people's weaknesses. And now, he understood Emma's. He began to shift his approach, using Joe's jealousy as leverage, manipulating their bond to test Emma's loyalty. He fed Gio misinformation, planted doubts, stirred the pot with whispers of betrayal. And Gio, already raw, began to believe them. It all came to a head when Dalton orchestrated a scenario that forced Emma to choose. Accompany him to a WSB debriefing where her access to high-level intelligence could be solidified, or stay behind with Gio, who had just been implicated in a breach of security that could destroy them all. The choice was brutal. And it revealed everything. Emma chose Gio. It wasn't clean. It wasn't noble. It was messy and impulsive and filled with screaming and tears and threats. But in that moment, she realized that all her ambitions, all her games, meant nothing if she lost the one person who had always believed in her, even when she didn't deserve it. Gio, stunned by her decision, tried to push her away. But Emma stayed. And in the wreckage of that choice, something new was born, not just love, but a partnership forged in fire. Dalton, humiliated and enraged, retreated, for now. But the damage had been done. Trust had been broken. Alliances had shifted. And the war brewing beneath the surface of Port Charles had found a new front. Emma and Gio, once pawns in a larger game, now stood at the center of the storm. And the secrets still to come, about Dalton, about WSB, about the shadows they thought they had escaped, would demand more than love to survive. It would demand loyalty. Sacrifice. And perhaps, the kind of ruthlessness Emma had once sworn she'd never use again. Because in Port Charles, love was never just love. It was always power. Always war. And the battlefield had just been redrawn. Gio had known for days that something was wrong, off, twisted, unsettled. The tension between him and Emma had thickened to the point of suffocation. Her laughter had become more guarded, her glances more careful, her absence more frequent and unexplained. He'd told himself it was nothing, that she was navigating her own alliances and strategies in the game they were all playing. But somewhere in his gut, an instinct sharpened by betrayal and loss whispered the truth before he was ready to hear it. And then he saw it. Not heard about it through whispers, not suspected it from a trail of clues. But saw it, Emma, in Dalton's penthouse, in Dalton's bed, her body pressed against his in a scene that would replay behind Joe's eyes with nightmarish clarity for weeks, months, maybe forever. It wasn't just the act. It was her face, the surrender, the vulnerability, the emotion she had once only shown him. And now, that face belonged to someone else. To Dalton. In that single moment, something inside Gio shattered. It wasn't just jealousy. It wasn't just heartbreak. It was the complete obliteration of the illusion he had clung to, that despite everything, despite the WSB secrets, despite the chaos of Port Charles, despite Emma's dance with danger, she had still been his in some unspoken way. That belief was gone now, turned to ash in the heat of betrayal. But along with the pain came something else, a terrifying clarity. Because in that broken moment, Gio saw more than just two bodies tangled together. He saw why. He saw the manipulation behind Dalton's seduction, the way he had wormed his way into Emma's vulnerabilities, the way he had used Joe's own jealousy as fuel. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a move in a larger game. And Gio had been outplayed. But not for long. The shock of witnessing that scene gave birth to a new version of Gio, harder, colder, more calculating. If Dalton thought he had won, if Emma thought she could lose herself in desire and walk away unscathed, they were both mistaken. Gio didn't retreat. He didn't explode in fury. He became something worse, silent, watchful, controlled. And with that silence came a decision. He wouldn't confront her. Not yet. Not while she was still under Dalton's spell. No. He would let her sink further, let her believe the illusion was working. Because when the time came, when the final cards were on the table, Gio would be the one holding the truth, the proof. The vengeance. And it wouldn't just be personal. Because now, he realized, the lines between emotion and mission had blurred. Dalton wasn't just a man who'd taken something from him, he was a threat to the entire WSB operation they had been tracking. A man with leverage, with ties that ran deeper than anyone had realized. If Emma was compromised, if she had fallen too far into Dalton's orbit, Gio would have to make a choice that would tear him apart, protect her, or take her down with Dalton. Everything was unraveling. Michael and Jason were already piecing together threads of the same conspiracy. Sasha, still reeling from the threats to Daisy's safety, had begun to notice shifts in Emma's behavior. Curtis and Jacinda had returned with damning evidence of Dalton's financial laundering tied to the remnants of Sidwell's network. And now, with Gio as both the witness and the betrayed. The emotional detonation at the center of Port Charles was primed to explode. Because what Gio saw wasn't just a betrayal of love. It was the turning point in a war. A war for control, for truth. For identity. A war that had begun in whispers and would end in blood. And Gio, once the innocent, once the observer, was now something else entirely. He was a weapon forged by heartbreak. And Dalton had just pulled the trigger. Emma had never forgotten the way Jocelyn humiliated her, not only by stealing Joe's attention, but by parading her triumph through every hallway of Port Charles. It wasn't simply romantic rivalry, what happened between them dug deeper. Touching the raw edges of abandonment and worthlessness that Emma had fought so long to suppress. She had survived her mother's disappearance, the weight of being Robert Scorpio's granddaughter. And years of expectations tethered to her last name. But what she could never fully endure was the slow disintegration of her identity in Joe's eyes the moment Jocelyn entered the picture. She could see it now in retrospect, the shift in his gaze, the diminishing softness, the slow erosion of the certainty she once held in their unspoken bond. And now, she had decided. She wouldn't just reclaim what had been stolen, she would burn every thread that connected Jocelyn to her world. Revenge would be art, not war. And Dalton would be her first brushstroke. Dalton had no idea what he was walking into when Emma began appearing more frequently in his orbit. At first, it was subtle, coincidental meetings. Shared confidences about meaningless frustrations at GH, casual conversations that danced on the edge of something more. He had always respected her intellect, even admired her composure. But there was a glint in her now that seemed magnetic, an undercurrent of intensity he hadn't felt in a long time. Emma knew precisely how to approach Dalton. She didn't rely on seduction in the traditional sense. Instead, she built trust like a fortress, created intimacy out of vulnerability. Strategically unveiling personal wounds that mirrored Dalton's own. Every time she dropped a truth about feeling invisible or used, he felt a flicker of reflection within himself. He was still grieving the failures of the WSB, still haunted by the choices that drove him away from a life of clarity and into a mire of espionage, betrayal, and fractured relationships. Emma's wounds felt familiar, her pain addictive. And slowly, without even realizing it, Dalton let her in. Gio, on the other hand, was spiraling into a darkness he hadn't experienced since his early childhood, the period before he understood who his real parents were, when everything felt borrowed, temporary, uncertain. He hadn't spoken to Brooke Lynn in days, too ashamed of his own behavior to face the disappointment in her voice. And Emma? She had vanished like mist, distant and unreachable, leaving behind only fragmented memories and the echo of arguments they'd left unresolved. It wasn't until he returned to his apartment unexpectedly one evening that he witnessed the truth unravel before his eyes. Through the cracked door of Dalton's temporary suite, he saw them, Emma, straddling Dalton on the couch, her hands tangled in his shirt, her mouth pressed desperately against his. It wasn't just the betrayal that shattered Gio. It was the way she clung to Dalton. The way she surrendered to him like Gio had never existed. The image burrowed into his mind like a parasite, feeding on every moment they'd shared. Every promise made in the sanctuary of whispers and dreams. Emma had anticipated Joe's reaction. She knew he would find out. That was the point. Her vengeance wasn't just about Jocelyn. It was about ripping open the part of Gio that still believed she was harmless. She needed him to hurt. She needed him to feel as powerless as she had when Jocelyn flaunted her victory. But as the adrenaline wore off and the reality of her actions began to crystallize, Emma felt something unfamiliar creep into her chest, doubt. Dalton wasn't a fool. He had sensed that her motivation wasn't purely romantic. And now, lying beside him in the hush of post-seduction, she watched his eyes as he stared at the ceiling, unmoving, unspeaking. It wasn't triumph she felt. It was emptiness. Meanwhile, Jocelyn was already tightening her grip on Vaughn, whose allegiance was growing murky. She had no idea what Emma had just unleashed. But she could feel the shift in the air. Vaughn was restless. His loyalty had been split down the center by unspoken truths and veiled threats. He had agreed to keep WSB's secrets buried. But if Emma's entanglement with Dalton reached the wrong ears, all hell could break loose. The confidential files Jocelyn had stolen from a dead drop weeks earlier, files that named Dalton as a former double agent working under Sidwell, were now in danger. Emma's presence in Dalton's life was a variable she could no longer control, and that infuriated her. But more than that, it frightened her. Because for all her bravado, Jocelyn knew that Emma was capable of destruction far beyond what anyone expected. Gio, enraged and humiliated, began pulling away from everyone. He didn't answer Dante's calls. He avoided Brooklyn. He shut out Jason and even ignored Sasha's concerned texts. All he could think about was the look on Emma's face as she kissed another man. It wasn't grief he felt, it was obsession. A burning need to reclaim what was his, to make her remember who she really belonged to. The dangerous part was that Gio didn't want to win her back with kindness. He wanted her to suffer. To crawl back to him broken and apologetic. And that thirst for dominance, for emotional revenge, was beginning to poison every thought. Dalton, too, was unraveling. His involvement with Emma, while unexpected, had opened doors inside him that should have remained closed. He had trusted her too quickly, too completely, forgetting the cardinal rule of his past life. Never trust anyone with something to lose. Emma had too much pain buried under too many layers, and he was starting to question whether her interest in him was real or simply tactical. The morning after their night together, he confronted her, not with anger, but with cold detachment. She denied nothing. She didn't need to. Her eyes told the whole story. And in that moment, Dalton understood that he had just become a pawn in a war he didn't even know existed. What neither of them realized was that Sasha had been watching. She had caught wind of Emma's pursuit of Dalton weeks earlier and had begun piecing together the implications. Her instincts screamed that something bigger was at play. Emma wasn't just acting out of heartbreak. She was leveraging power. And power always meant secrets. Sasha began digging, into WSB archives, into medical records, into the encrypted notes left behind by her late husband. What she found made her blood run cold. There were references to Project Blacklight, a covert operation involving emotional manipulation experiments tied to the same biotech firm Sidwell once worked with. And Emma's name, her real name. Not the alias she had used while volunteering in Zurich, was listed in a declassified file marked Subject Omega. Now the stakes had escalated beyond romance or revenge. Emma was no longer just a girl scorned. She was possibly the linchpin in a much darker conspiracy. Jocelyn, Vaughn, Geo, and Dalton were all entangled in a game that had been set in motion long before anyone understood the rules. And as Emma stood in front of the mirror that night, wiping away the remnants of Dalton's kiss from her lips, she smiled, not out of satisfaction, but because she finally felt something that had eluded her for so long. Control. And she was never letting it go again. The war between Emma and Jocelyn was no longer a simmering rivalry. It had erupted into a full-scale psychological battlefield, one marked by betrayal, calculated manipulation, and dangerously obsessive undercurrents that were beginning to consume everyone around them. What had once been a clash of wounded hearts had now become a clash of legacies, identities, and secrets buried too deep to be safely unearthed. Emma, once the girl with composure, heritage, and a fierce sense of purpose, had transformed into a strategist fueled by silent rage and vengeance. And Jocelyn, long considered the golden daughter of Port Charles, had turned calculating in her own right. Determined not just to protect what was hers, but to annihilate any threat to her dominance. Their enmity wasn't merely personal, it was symbolic of a generational reckoning between past loyalties and future power. Emma's calculated seduction of Dalton was just the beginning. She wasn't seeking love anymore, she was seeking leverage. And with each step she took into the shadows of his past, she uncovered truths that not even the WSB wanted resurrected. She used charm as a weapon, truth as bait, and vulnerability as a disguise, slowly positioning herself in the center of a web that reached into every dark corridor of Port Charles's power structure. But what Emma hadn't anticipated was how deeply this would unearth her own dormant demons. The further she pressed against Jocelyn, the more she found herself unraveling, not out of weakness, but because revenge had become a part of her identity. She could no longer tell where her pain ended and her ambition began. Jocelyn, on the other hand, wasn't simply reacting, she was escalating. After discovering that Emma had shared a bed with Dalton, she didn't break. She plotted. Vaughn, whose loyalty had begun to fray, was pulled deeper into Jocelyn's grip, not out of love, but out of fear. She whispered in his ear about Emma's past in Zurich, about the rumors of her WSB involvement, about her access to dangerous intel that could collapse more than just reputations. Jocelyn framed herself not as a scorned rival, but as a guardian of national security, manipulating Vaughn into believing that Emma's obsession wasn't romantic, it was political. And if she wasn't stopped, everything they'd worked for could burn. The city could feel the tension between the two girls like static in the air. GH became a war zone of whispers. Jason and Sasha began questioning Emma's motives, while even Geo, still haunted by the vision of Emma with Dalton, started to wonder if what he saw was the act of a broken woman or a tactician executing a much darker mission. And yet, in the middle of this storm, both Emma and Jocelyn continued to smile, continued to speak in pleasantries and nod politely at events, each one knowing that the next move could destroy the other. But the obsession didn't stay contained to whispers and mind games. Physical consequences began to appear. Amelia's mysterious illness, the leaked files from the GH database, the anonymous threats sent to Daisy's school, all bore the fingerprints of someone orchestrating chaos behind the scenes. And while both Emma and Jocelyn accused the other in silence, the truth was murkier. Because somewhere along the way, the war they started had spiraled into something neither of them could fully control. It was no longer just about Geo, or Dalton, or Vaughn, it was about identity, power, and who would define the future of Port Charles. And in that chaos, the obsession became mutual. Emma began dreaming of Jocelyn's downfall not just as revenge, but as destiny. Jocelyn began fearing Emma not as a rival, but as a mirror, someone who reflected back her own capacity for cruelty, her own hunger for dominance. Their conflict had become more than a feud, it was a manifestation of generational trauma, romantic betrayal, and institutional secrets all colliding in the hearts of two young women who had been raised in the shadows of legends and now fought for the right to rewrite their own story. And with every move they made, every lie they told, every truth they buried, the city edged closer to a collapse that would reveal just how much damage obsession can do when it wears the face of innocence.